All right, so here's the scenario for your squat. You've taken the correct stance, so you've got your heels at roughly shoulder width. You've got your toes pointed out about 30 degrees. You've got the bar positioned securely just below your traps, resting on that nice shelf provided by your bunched up delts in the position that's often referred to as the low bar position. You've taken a big breath, your chest is up, you're holding that breath tightly with every single muscle in your midsection, in your trunk contracted hard. You're holding that breath throughout the entire rep, so you're bracing correctly. But for some reason, your squat simply feels off. It feels as though there should be a more efficient, a stronger way to do what it is that you're trying to do. And indeed, there is. There are two very common problems with the squat, and we're going to address both of them here in this video. One has to do with the descent, how you go down into the bottom of the squat, and one, not surprisingly, has to do with the ascent. Let's start with the problem that shows up in the descent, because in order to have an effective ascent, in order to effectively drive back up out of the hole, we've got to get into the correct position at the bottom of the squat first. So the problem that we're talking about in the descent is the problem of trying to stay upright as you start to descend. In other words, to try to keep your torso or to try to keep your back angle vertical. We've got a lot of fitness magazines, a lot of fitness media to kind of thank for this mental picture that's been created in our head of this almost vertical torso as you descend. It turns out that that is not an efficient, it's not a strong, it's not an effective way to squat. So we've got a cue to solve this, and it's actually kind of a squat trifecta of cues. The cues are simply hips back, chest down, knees apart. Now, when I say knees apart, I really just mean that your knees are going to go in the direction of your toes. So your toes are pointing forward and out, which means your knees are going to go forward, of course, because that's what knees generally do when they bend, but they're going to do that anyway. You're going to focus specifically on getting the knees to go apart so that the knees go in the direction of your toes. So your toes are going to function essentially as arrows for your knees, for your femurs. You're going to especially focus on the hips back, chest down aspect. So note that chest up can be a reasonable setup cue when you're getting ready to squat, right? You take a big breath, you think to yourself, chest up. Chest big or big chest might be a better cue because, again, chest up is a reasonable setup cue, but it's not a good movement cue. Instead, as you start to move, you're going to think hips back, chest down. You are, in part, solving a geometry problem. You have to get limbs and joints out of the way so that you can actually achieve depth in the squat. And we want to get our hips back so that the hips are in a real good position to drive up out of the hole. So again, this is your squat trifecta for the descent. Hips back, chest down, knees apart. So that's going to help us solve the problem of the descent, the problem on the descent of trying to stay too upright. In other words, yes, you're going to purposefully lean over. So the question is, what about the problem on the ascent? Well, it's actually a very similar problem. The problem on the descent is that of trying to stay upright. The problem on the ascent is usually, very often, if someone even gets into the correct position on the way down, sometimes they will try to get upright too quickly on the way back up. In other words, they're trying to get their back angle or they're trying to get their torso vertical right away as they come back up from the bottom of the squat. Now, of course, we're going to finish in a vertical position, right? We start with a vertical torso, we're going to finish with a vertical torso, but it turns out when you get vertical makes a big difference in how efficient, how strong your squat is. And trying to get that torso vertical right away makes for a less efficient, a weaker squat. So when you get vertical matters, and the solution is twofold here. You can either cue yourself to drive your hips up out of the hole. Don't worry, everything else should come up with your hips because you're going to have your back set in flat, in rigid extension. So you can cue yourself to drive your hips up out of the hole, or you can cue yourself to stay in your lean. In other words, stay leaned over longer than you think on the ascent. Again, you're going to finish vertically, but don't try to get vertical right away. Stay in your lean. So if I'm using my arm to kind of mimic your torso here, right? Here's your hips, here's your shoulder, here's your head. As you're driving up, what you're trying to avoid is this early raising of the torso, this trying to get vertical too soon. Now, don't worry, we're also not trying to raise the hips before anything else. Sometimes people refer to that as performing a good morning squat or good morninging your squat. That's not what we're talking about either. That's not the goal. But for people with this problem in the squat, that's not usually an issue anyway. We're usually dealing with the problem of someone trying to raise the torso first, because that's kind of the human tendency, is to try to get back to this vertical torsoed position as soon as possible. So what we're looking for is for the hips and the shoulders to rise at roughly the same time for about, let's just say, the first half of the ascent. Now, in reality, there will always be a little bit of a back angle angle change as you hit the turnaround, right? As you hit that bounce out of the bottom. But it should be exactly that. It should be a relatively small back angle change. So to sum up, on the descent, here's your squat trifecta: hips back, chest down, knees apart. And on the ascent, drive your hips or stay in your lean. As always, we hope these tips help you get stronger and live better.